Once upon a time, there were 5 Alices. Alice number 1, June Lee. Alice number 2, Adrian Sesh. Alice number 3, Julie Robinson. Alice number 4, Nayland Blake. And me, number 5. Together we were called the Alices Walking. I had invited 6 guests to come and see us walk. The guests were required to attend a single rehearsal in order to practice watching the Alices walk. It was 2 hours before the actual walk was to begin. I asked the guests to sit quietly on baby chairs that I had provided for them on a stage that was actually little more than a giant freestanding pedestal. I gave them handheld tablets loaded with custom augmented reality software that I called the Looking Glass. The guests were supposed to use the tablets to watch the Alices strike poses as they traversed the stage. Through the app, each guest could see animated lyrics embedded in the Alices' costumes, sung by the Alices as they walked their walks. The lyrics were a part of a composition by our collaborator, the composer Edmund Campion. But when the action had just barely begun, the guests suddenly leaped out of their baby chairs, falling on their knees before the Alices as if they were gods. Oh no, I thought, the guests have gone mad. And even more so, they're going to fall off the pedestal, break their legs, and I am going to get sued. So I was firm. You cannot get out of your chairs. Please, when the performance begins, you must stay in your chairs. An hour later, I invited the audience in. The Alices were securely positioned, the guests carefully seated in their baby chairs, holding their augmented reality tablets. The stage was cordoned off by red velvet ropes, enclosing an area filled with empty folding chairs. Suddenly, all hell broke loose. Once they caught a glimpse of the Alices, the audience, at first calmly waiting in line in order to enter the seating area where they were to watch the Alices walk their walks, crashed through the velvet ropes and tried to storm the stage. The theater attendants could not contain them. The audience also went mad. A new series of works commenced from these events. I called it Alice Unchained. It was long ago and far away, in a land somewhere to the north. A French sponsor of my animation, Alice Unchained, had directed me to a professional motion capture studio, their Dépendance, located in a small city where I had few acquaintances. Colleagues of my husband had generously agreed to house me. A couple. One was an illustrious curator of digital arts, and the other, the provost of a lauded university and digital arts research center. I arrived with my collaborators, 2 performers, one a professional wrestler named Isaías Velasquez, and the other Christina Isabel, a choreographer and classically trained dancer. My concept was to combine both of their performances inside one avatar body, a gender-fluid remix. I flew them both up there to that northern city and hosted them in a nearby Airbnb. The production was self-funded at a cost to me of my life's savings, but worth it. The capture was gifted by an old friend, a mocap pioneer who consulted for Hollywood effects films. My sponsor. My usual art context, however, was in the commercial gallery system, surviving there by the skin of my teeth with limited sales, but mostly by adjunct teaching. At the time of these events, when I was 52, I had just landed my first full-time teaching job at an illustrious art school. I have since retired from that life, but when I arrived at that art school 15 years earlier, I was bankrupt, my employers having rescued me in all ways. A damsel, as always, in distress. Now, back to the story. Post-capture, we went to dinner to celebrate our imminent departures. My collaborators were to leave the next morning. At dinner, my hostess explained to my collaborators in an intimate aside, "She's impossible." I was humiliated. I will never forget it. The next day, I returned to the professional motion capture studio to consult with the professional motion capture director. I then returned to the small apartment in which my hosts were lodging me. It was their guest apartment, built in their basement when they reconstructed their ancient townhouse into a beautiful modernist design. I had my own keys. Having learned that I was impossible, I felt that my only option was to minimize my presence henceforth. I made my excuses. I have a pressing deadline. I have to work. I then retreated to the basement, snacking on my personal supplies: apples, nuts, rice cakes, herbal tea, and soy milk. The next day was spent at the professional motion capture studio. After my meeting, I returned to the basement flat. Much to my horror, I found that I could no longer turn on the apartment lights. I must have blown a fuse. One table lamp still worked. I had some light, just enough. I am impossible. I woke up the next morning to a catastrophic snowstorm, the worst in 20 years. All flights canceled. I decided to continue working and to continue to practice invisibility. I am impossible. Snacking on nuts and apples, I worked quietly in my basement for 3 days and 3 nights. I was afraid to tell my hostess about the darkness, because in fact, she was right. I am impossible. I'd broken her guest flat. On the 4th day, the snow cleared. I could fly out. My host and hostess came down to the basement to help me into an awaiting Uber. I apologized to them profusely for blowing their lighting, but my hostess explained kindly, "No worries, no fuse blown. Just a case of turning off the master light switch." She flipped it on. Then there was light. I thanked them both with the utmost sincerity. Then we all embraced. After that, I stepped into the Uber, drove to the airport, and flew back uneventfully to my illustrious school. One day, Alice decided to build a magical house, a halfway house in which everything was real, but at the same time, unreal. It was supposed to be an art show filled with chairs and tables and all kinds of furnishings. Alice called the house a house on the borderline. It was a figure of her imagination. It was the early 1980s, and at that time, Alice was only 26 years old. She was an editor of a famous design magazine, so people were in the habit of taking the young Alice very seriously. She had that job, and therefore was a very good person to know. Alice was also a very tiny person, a silver slipper of a girl. In fact, a kind of elf. Very cute. So she got that fancy job, and then she got to make this fancy show. Alice walked around Manhattan looking for magical objects to furnish her house. Someone told her about a guy with a loft in an area that was then called the Flower District. The guy made huge pots, something like a jug, but a jug made for a giant. She thought, perfect. Not just the pots, but also their location. The Flower District. What a great setting for her fairy tale. She decided to go visit the man to see his pots. So Alice strolled over to the Flower District. The pot guy buzzed her in. He lived on the 5th floor, so she took the elevator up. But much to her surprise, instead of going to 5, the elevator stopped at 3. The door opened. There was a pause. And then a very angry man reached into the elevator and grabbed Alice by the throat. That's all she remembered. 7 years later, I woke up to find myself now an artist too, but an unusual kind of artist, possessed by the irresistible urge to fight. At first, I trained with a boxer. He drove me very hard, but I always did what he wanted. I guess it was a little weird. The boxer was filled with curiosity about this, so eventually he asked me, "Was your father by chance a military man?" Not military, not at all. Instead, Robert suffered from hallucinations and invested in stocks from the confines of a computer room hidden in the back of our garage. In fact, he did quite well with them. So I answered, no. In the winters, the boxer went north to ski, returning to regale me with tales of snow bunnies. The girls he chased up there in the mountains with their fluffy white fuzzy coats. He also bought me a set of pink boxing gloves that I used to train. One day, I punched him in the face. It's true, he had a very beautiful face. After that, he never showed up for any of our training sessions, not a one. I complained to the management, but nobody cared. Later, I moved to Chicago to teach at a famous art school there. When I arrived, I searched for another trainer to teach me how to fight. I was fortunate enough to make the acquaintance of the excellent Isaias Velasquez, a wrestler of repute. He could have been a contender, but he found that he hated traveling. He missed his mother, he explained to me once. So he quit the National Wrestling Association and became a hero on the local scene. I stalked his matches. I was the middle-aged woman in the back of the ring. Isaias would leave my name at the door so his bouncers could look after me. His was a sensitive soul. After some years of this, I invited Isaias up north, where I had access to a professional motion capture studio. I certainly wanted to capture him, but also to cast him in Alice Unchained, a virtual reality ballet that I made to merge the performances of Isaias and a ballerina, Christina Isabel, into the body of a single avatar. Another of my irresistible enactments. My little brother is also a fighter. He is known for his quick wit and sharp tongue. He loves to startle people with the truth, point blank. He's also an Oregon state's attorney. His job is to sue large pharmaceutical corporations. David is a litigator, the guy who stands up in court and argues the case before the judge. But unlike me, he always wins. He is my hero. In 2018, our mother Shirley died. As she requested, we cremated her. She died on Christmas Eve when it was snowy and cold. So we waited 6 months until spring broke and then went down to the river behind her house to scatter her ashes. That's what she wanted. It was a rainy, windy day, and the scattering was a bit complicated. Hard for David to actually get the ashes into the water and not to blow back into his face. But he did it. Shirley dissolved into the turbulent waters of the Delaware, and me and David said goodbye to her. I finished Alice, my trans ballet, a few months later. But that day with the ashes was actually the end for me. I never fought again. That same year, Isaias, my wrestler, was injured. One of his sparring buddies accidentally dropped him on his head. He was hospitalized for months, but I never visited him once, not even a single time. Although someone else did. A lady wrestler going by the name of Kylie Ray. When he got out of the hospital, Kylie bought him a dog. Soon after, they married. And just as you might have expected, they all lived together, happily ever after.
That's really what it is, exactly. Don't do anything stupid.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Surely love this river.
The wind is from the back.
This is a must. Bye, Mom. Bye, Mom.
That's a really cool spot.
Beautiful.
It's perfect.
It's perfect.
All
And
right.
also total dissolve by now, even. There's no washing up.
Cool.
A girl called me who I vaguely knew, a hot curator on the digital art scene. It was 2014. She was on the curatorial board of a computer art center. Let's call it X. X was the epicenter of digital chic in those days. Located in downtown Manhattan, in a neighborhood formerly known as the Flower District. The girl suggested that I apply for the X Fellowship. You get $35K to make a project and studio space for a year. I was astonished. Me? It didn't seem possible. You may ask yourself, why? It's cultural. It has to do with taste. Mine, I have finally surmised, is not really digital enough. I like New Yorker cartoons. I also love the period rooms at the Met, and even more so, those tiny dollhouses in the basement of the Art Institute of Chicago. It has to do with my legacy. My mother had cultural aspirations. We lived in Lefrak City, a 4,605 apartment complex in the southernmost region of Corona, Queens. Our apartment was filled with those cardboard Matisse paintings that came pre-framed. I'm not sure where my mother got them. Maybe in the gift shop at the Brooklyn Museum, when she would bring me every week to the Kitty Art School, free and open to the public. Shirley didn't allow television, so I never watched. As a result, I have no feeling for memes. I don't find them funny. It's true, I am a populist, but for the digital art scene, not the right kind. I am a romantic. I love certain kinds of banality, but not the internet meme kind. I love art for the people, but to me this means the art of the blockbuster museum show. Impressionism, Cubism, Matisse, Seurat, Van Gogh. I like pretty things. So I have no love for science fiction. I also cannot fathom innovation culture. New gadgets leave me cold. I'm not really digital art material, but everyone longs to be invited, and yippee, I finally was. So I applied for the 35K. I didn't get it, but I did get something else. The use of SpaceX, though no money and limited support. Being a native New Yorker, however, I did know value when I saw it. I'd spent a lifetime learning about the importance of real estate in a central location, and X was downtown on the ground floor. I therefore decided to stage a spectacle there, an opera I would call The Alice's Walking. I also happened to have 35K in personal savings, so I decided to stake it all on Alice. The first step was the welcome panel, where me and the real fellows introduced our projects and our works. If I believed in angels, I might think that an angel sent me the young girls I met after I sat down on that panel. Me and the fellows were introduced, along with our work. I showed my watery floating avatars on the giant X screen. Afterwards, a bunch of young women gathered around me. A pretty one with braids on her head and round cheeks came up. "I am Greta Lova," she said. "We love you. You are our inspiration." I was shocked. "You mean you actually know who I am?" I cannot express my astonishment. A second girl, Julie Robinson, a dark beauty with masses of curly hair, also introduced herself. She had studied fashion at Parsons and offered her expertise. A few weeks later, we set up our perch on the unheated balcony of X, and there we stitched and we sewed, we stitched and we sewed, for 4 months. On Saturday, March 8th at 6 p.m., the Alices walked. At the after-party, I served potent cocktails, sprinkled with flower petals in delicate cups. I wandered around the vast space of X, too distracted to speak. I soon bumped into a powerful gallerist, famous for showing digital art, with a collector in tow. I offered them second cocktails. The gallerist looked down at me through veiled eyes. I looked back up at him, hopefully. "What did you think?" "Not interactive enough," he said. Oh well, what could I say? A few years later, the Alices were audited by the U.S. Tax Service. Alice was quite incomprehensible to them. What exactly does Alice have to do with your job, with being a teacher at an art school? After dozens of letters back and forth with various unhelpful but friendly folks at the U.S. Tax Service, I finally hit the jackpot with a kind lady called Mrs. Brown. "Please explain to me," said Mrs. Brown, "what that crazy thing you did has to do with art. We talked about it, and we here at the tax service think that art is painting and drawing, and, well, maybe also sculpture, but we will have to discuss that one further." Me and Mrs. Brown spoke at length, and finally we understood one another. Being an art teacher at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I had plenty of practice, so I was able to smoothly explain digital and conceptual art to Mrs. Brown. I also explained that my teaching contract required me to show my work regularly in places of consequence and to have it written about in order to prove my value. Because if I didn't have any value, even though I did have tenure, I could still get fired. "Oh my God," said Mrs. Brown. "That's awful." Yes, it is. And to prove it, I gave her my contract to read, where it was all stated in the fine print. "That's incomprehensible," said Mrs. Brown. "I recommend that you get a letter from your dean explaining that fine print in plain English." "That should do it," she said. "And we need reviews, lots of reviews. You need to prove your value." Oh my God, I thought. $35,000 in value? I definitely had 6 or 7 reviews, not counting that really hysterical, nasty rant by Patty Johnson, and hoped that by tax service standards, that was enough. I wrote to my dean. "Could I have a letter?" "Let me get back to you," they said. "I need to consult our lawyers." A few days later, they wrote me a letter of sincere apology. "I am sorry, but the lawyers told me that such a letter is impossible. I am sure you know how lawyers are, and I am sure you understand." What I actually did understand, however, was that the internet would love to know about how supportive my famous social justice art school was to their staff. I received my testimonial letter a few days later, and then I won my case. The Alice audit took a full year. Afterwards, my accountant invoiced me $10,000. The late fees and penalties for the $800 in back taxes, which is the pittance that I actually owed, amounted to another $8,000, bringing the grand total for the Alices up to $53,000. But in the end, I consider it a bargain. A small price to pay for those girls. Greta and Julie and Carla and Sophie and Snow and Regina and Morishine and Angeline and Caroline and Violet, plus all of the rest. The girls I met later, and the ones I will also meet in the future, who I count to this day as my life's greatest investment.